Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I find it a little bit ironic that I've worked in counterterrorism for a long, long time, and I've never actually made it here for this conference. And after finally making it out, it's the year that Asaf is not here. So a bit ironic. It is also, of course, telling to be here as an American on 9/11. In that said, I'll just tell a little bit of a story, because 9/11 for me was both symbolically and literally the beginning of my career. I'm a Californian originally and flew out to Washington, D.C. after graduating from college. I arrived on September 10th. 9/11, 2001 was quite literally my first morning in Washington, D.C. looking for a job as an adult. And I still very much remember the vibration when plane hit the Pentagon. I wasn't too far away at the time. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the way that we think about the distribution of terrorist propaganda online. My role at Facebook, I'm responsible for all aspects of our counterterrorism work. That is dealing with propaganda online. It's dealing with how do we engage governments on these issues, how do we engage civil society, all of those sorts of questions. And it's interesting. I've been at Facebook about 18 months. Prior to that, of course, I worked essentially as an academic at West Point, and then at think tanks in Washington, D.C., thinking about these issues from the policy side. And I'll tell you that the engagement of social media companies generally has changed dramatically in the last 6 or 7 years. In 2010, when I was at a place called the New America Foundation, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., I helped set up some of the very first engagements between the National Counterterrorism Center and representatives from social media companies. And at the time, what NCTC was trying to get across was something called the Community Awareness Briefing, which essentially was, at the time, it was a brief about Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born, or not American-born, excuse me, but the American al-Qaeda propagandist, very slick English speaker. In many ways was the sort of canary in the coal mine of the kind of global propaganda we see today in English. And what was interesting at the time was that really this was in 2010, the story was government officials, civil society, trying to explain that there was a problem out there that companies needed to pay attention to. And when I think about this engagement between companies and dealing with terrorism on their platforms, I think about that as sort of phase one, where there was an educational process. None of the social media platforms were set up to facilitate this kind of behavior. The founders didn't imagine that it would ever occur. All of these companies, Facebook included, Google, Twitter, were set up to enable people to communicate with one another more effectively. And all of the positive things that come from that, allowing people to communicate across borders, across cultural lines, etc. And so there was this early period where companies, I think, had to come to terms with the fact that there were bad actors out there using their platforms. I think that framing has persisted, that understanding of the discussion between government folks and companies has persisted longer than it has been real. We have moved past that phase. Companies are taking this very seriously, and they understand much about the challenge. And so now the question is not so much how do we get companies to take this problem seriously? It's how do we have a conversation about what this dynamic really looks like online so that we can address it more effectively? Those are the questions that I'm focused on a daily basis. Not should we take this on, but how do we take this on best? How do we get better at finding propaganda and removing it quickly? Those are the questions that I'm dealing with. That fundamental issue that was still sort of being debated a decade ago is not being debated anymore. We're out to find this stuff. We don't want it on our platform. So what is sort of Facebook's posture on this today? Well, it's really very simple. There is no place for terrorism on Facebook. Praise, support, representation of Terrorism on our platform violates the terms of service, what we refer to as the community standards. And when we find it, we remove it. The trick, of course, is how do you find it? How do you find it quickly? And we do that in a variety of ways. Really what this comes down to is it's a combination of utilizing human beings for what human beings are very good at and utilizing computers for what computers can do very well, which essentially is go through lots of information very, very quickly. So we rely on reports from our community. Every report of a potential terms of service violation at Facebook gets a look for a potential terrorism nexus. And if there is one, if the initial reviewer thinks that there is one, it will be escalated to a team of specialists. We have about 150 people at Facebook, broadly speaking, whose primary responsibility is dealing with terrorism. Primary responsibility. That includes people in our operations teams that are reviewing those kinds of reports. That includes lawyers. That includes policy folks like myself. Includes some investigators, etc. So that's really important, is that connection to the community, because the community sees things and understands new trends and oftentimes alerts us to things that we weren't aware of otherwise. But we're also, of course, increasingly using automation. And automation is key because it can operate at scale in a way that's very, very difficult. We have more than 2 billion monthly users on Facebook. They speak more than 80 languages. Keeping tabs on everything that occurs is a real legitimate challenge. And automation is one way that we can do this. We use a variety of techniques. I'm not going to walk you through everything. But we use photo and video matching. We fan out from accounts and groups and pages that we've identified as problematic. We use machine learning on the language in content that we've removed so that we can find similar kinds of content, especially clusters of similar kinds of content. And we're doing a lot more, and I think this is exciting, to prevent recidivists, what we refer to as recidivists, accounts that we've removed and they come back with a fake account. Because that happens all the time, of course, right? When we remove a terrorist from the platform, they try to come back in another way. We're getting a lot better at identifying those folks and preventing them from coming back. None of this is perfect. None of this is perfect. And so that's one of the calls that I have for folks today is it's not perfect, but we really want to get better. We really want to have a constructive conversation about how we can get better. And with rooms like this, full of experts from government, from academia, my call is let's have that constructive conversation about the things where you may see gaps that we don't know about. But if those gaps are there, we want to fill them. And so let's have the conversation from a place of sort of shared interest and shared commitment. We don't need to be badgered into doing this. We want to do it, really want to do it. But we miss things, and you see stuff that we don't. So we want to hear about it. I want to hear about it. One of the most important pieces, and I'm going to try to keep this short because I know Stevie Weinberg's probably having a heart attack trying to keep us on schedule. But is our cross-industry work, right? We've heard from the United Nations, and I think one of the things that's really important here is the work that we're doing with industry, across industry. There has been informal collaboration and cooperation between companies on these issues long before companies were public about it. There were informal conversations talking about terms of service, talking about particular trends that they saw, lots of back and forth emails and messages when we would see something on YouTube, for example, that we wanted to alert them to, and vice versa. Those kinds of efforts have now congealed into some firm commitments and some real programs going forward. The umbrella for this is known as the Global Internet Forum for Counter-Terrorism, or GIFCT as we're calling it. We announced this formally on August 1st at an event in San Francisco. There's going to be a series of events coming up at the UN General Assembly in New York. And what this is, essentially, this was Google, YouTube, Microsoft, and Twitter, and Facebook coming together initially to pull together a wider set of companies with 3 basic lines of effort. The first is information sharing. And part of this is, the larger companies that have been at this for a while, and Facebook falls into that category, so do the other founding companies. We've learned a lot in the last couple of years. We've learned a lot about how to frame terms of service. We've learned a lot about how to identify patterns. We've learned a lot about how to share information with one another. And GiftCT is designed where we can share some of those learnings with some smaller companies that are coming to the fore. This is really important. There are smaller companies out there. They don't have the ability to hire someone like myself that has a real background in these sorts of things. But we don't see this as a competitive issue. We want to share some of the knowledge that we've developed. And frankly, we may learn things from some of those smaller companies that we hadn't considered. But countering terrorism from our perspective is something that we want to do as an industry, and we want to help companies get better at it so that they have a shorter learning curve. So that's one sort of line of effort. The second is technical cooperation. And there's a variety of ways that this could manifest over time. This is brand new. And so some of this is still going to be worked out. But the core piece of the technical cooperation that I just want to highlight is we are now sharing hashes. A hash is like a digital fingerprint of a file, of a piece of content. We are now sharing hashes of known terrorist propaganda with one another in a database. The database exists. There's lots of hashes in there. We share them, we use them. And let me just give you an example, right? Most of the time when another company puts a hash in the database, we've already found it. We found it ourselves. We're pretty good at finding this kind of stuff when the content is hosted on Facebook. We're not perfect, but we're pretty good. But there was an instance not that long ago where one of the other companies put in a hash for essentially a bomb-making manual. It had slipped through our systems. I'm not sure exactly why, but it had. We took that hash, we put it into our own internal systems, and we found more than 100 copies of that on our platform. It had no place there. We didn't want it there. And that database helped us find it. So you can see one of the other things we're really trying to do is give a little bit more transparency into how we're thinking about these things. We want to talk frankly about these issues. And I think that's one of the big changes that you've seen from that sort of phase 1 to phase 2 period in companies taking this challenge on. We want to talk about the things we try and the things that don't work. We want to talk about the things we try that seem to work. We want to talk about the things that work for a while, and then the terrorists change their tactics and they don't work so well anymore. We want to hear what you think might work. So that's technical cooperation. The hash sharing is in progress. It's going to improve. We can improve the infrastructure. We can improve the speed. We can improve the scale. It's going to get better over time. The last piece of this that I think is really interesting, particularly for the IDC folks and the other academics here in the room, is we want to collaborate on research as companies. We want to drive some research. And I'd urge you, if you have ideas about the things that need to be studied, to please share them with me or others, over email is fine. We want to drive a shared agenda so that we can all learn collectively about this. And that could both be research on what the terrorists are doing, research ideas about the kinds of things you see that are working on our end, but also what should the infrastructure look like? What is the governance model for some of this? How do we as companies engage one another? Where are the right lines? And those questions, I think, remain to be answered. Lastly, and I'll wrap it up in just a sec here, is to say thank you again for the opportunity to be here with a group of people that I know recognizes the scourge of terrorism, the challenge that we all face. And we certainly think of this room of folks as partners, and I hope that you do see the same in us. Thanks very much.